back to 80/20 TV. I am Kelly King, and we're here today with Jim Hanchett, who is the Director of Marketing and Communications for the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. Welcome to the show, Jim.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So, you have a really interesting and impressive job, but really that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about your job before this amazing job, because it's even more interesting. I remember when I first met you, I didn't know who you were or where you came from, so I Googled you, and the first thing that popped up was an image of you on a billboard, and you were the anchorman for the news station down in Charlotte, North Carolina. So
I'm pretty important.
tell me about that and how you got to be an anchorman, and I also know a little bit that there was a lot going on before you became an anchorman.
Well, you might call it a billboard, but I like to think of it as a shrine. And surprisingly, a lot of people didn't come by and just stand in amazement and look at it. But part of being in local television is promoting the talent, and I was talent in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so they put up a big billboard, which is kind of cool. My kids didn't think it was nearly as cool as I did, but they should have, shouldn't they?
Yeah, they should.
Yeah. And before I did local television in Charlottesville and in Wilmington, North Carolina, I was a correspondent for NBC News for about 10 years and got to travel around the country and around the world and see some neat things. So it's been an interesting path, and now I'm at IU and meeting you, and it's good stuff.
Obviously, he knows exactly what he's doing here. It's very humbling. But anyways, tell us about some of those interesting stories that you had, because you went through history in a very interesting way with an interesting perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I worked for NBC in the 1990s and the early part of this century, and that was a tumultuous time in our country. Not quite like today, but a lot went on. I covered the O.J. Simpson trial. I covered the riots in South Central Los Angeles, the bombing in Oklahoma City, the standoff in Waco that ended with David Koresh's compound going up in flames. I went to Calcutta, India for Mother Teresa's funeral. I covered the Bush-Gore election that ended up in the Supreme Court, and then I was fortunate enough to be in the Supreme Court as the justices decided the outcome of that election. And then, of course, 9/11 was a date I don't think anybody that was alive then will forget. And I lived in suburban Washington at the time and had a pager. You remember pagers?
Yes, I do.
Yes, and the pager goes off, and I'm told I need to take a flight to New York because a plane has hit a skyscraper. And I'm thinking to myself, oh great, my day is gone here. I'm going to fly up there, and some nut in a Cessna whacked his wing against the side of a building, and 2 people died, and who cares, and Friday or whatever day it was is shot. And it was a beautiful day. It was just a fabulous day. And so I put my things together, and I'm grumbling, and I'm mad, and I'm driving to Dulles Airport, and the pager goes off and says, no, airspace has been closed. You've got to turn around and drive to New York. So I flipped around on the Dulles Tollway and started driving to New York, thinking not only is today gone, but so is tomorrow and the day after that. And then the scope of what was going on became clear. And as I crossed from Virginia into Maryland, across the bridge, I was told, no, a plane has hit the Pentagon, you have to drive to the Pentagon. And then I was driving down, I think it's the Clara Barton Parkway in Washington, and all of a sudden it was clear that our country was under attack, right? And so, but I've got a family, and I've just driven away from them, and who knew what was going to happen next? No one knew what was going to happen next. And I had friends that worked at the Pentagon. Everybody in Washington has friends that work at the Pentagon.
Right.
So I got on the phone with my wife and I said, okay, we're under attack. This is not a safe place to be. Start packing stuff up, and here's how you drive to the mountains of West Virginia. Because being in Washington didn't make sense at that moment.
Right.
And so she starts putting that together, and now I've made the transition from crossing the bridge into Maryland, and now I'm almost downtown, and I got to get to the Pentagon, but chaos had ensued, right? I mean, it was just nuts.
Yeah.
And people are streaming out of the buildings, and I'm driving with the window down, wondering what's coming out of the sky next. And people are coming out of the buildings and trying to get out of downtown Washington, and me, I'm driving right to it. And they're running out of the buildings and looking up in the sky. And I'm driving, trying to look up in the sky and trying not to hit anybody because the rules of the road were gone. It was like every man for himself, right? And so I get downtown to the Capitol, and then they said, go to the Pentagon, and I ended up pretty much walking to the Pentagon, and the building is still up in flames, and there are people living and dying inside the building still at that hour, and you realize it's one of those purest moments in life when you don't know what's going to happen next, and momentous things are going on, and they're sort of out of your control, and you're living totally in the moment. And in one way, it's an awful story, and one would never want it to happen. On the other hand, it's a moment when you're truly tested, is what do you know? How can you stay calm? How can you tell people what they need to know? So that was just one of the things that went on in that period when I was at NBC, and you just, wow, I lived a lot of life during that period and got to see some just amazing things and meet amazing people at difficult times.
That is incredible. And it's all for the story, all to get the story. So tell us a little more about your strategy for storytelling. Now we're all into digital storytelling.
Sure.
And what are your strategies for telling a compelling, really interesting story?
One of the things, whether it's at something like that, or it's at the Supreme Court, or it's just a dumpster fire, is the amount of knowledge you have going into it, and the amount of reading you've done, the amount of understanding you've done, and the number of stories you've covered, and so that you have a basis of knowledge when you get there, and you can pull from that information and deal with the consequences of what you're seeing and interpret them, because you've sort of been there and done that to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. Even if you've never been there to a terrorist attack. I was at Oklahoma City when the building blew up, so you just have some things inside you that help inform that moment. The second thing is look for the real people. There's a tendency in a situation like that to go to the official people. The real people will tell you the story. The official people will give you the information. Another thing is that everything you think you know is probably wrong. The initial few minutes after something awful happens in this country, or often after something wonderful happens, the information is actually incorrect. It's nobody's fault. Mm-hmm. It's just the way the world works. I remember standing in Atlanta after the bombing of the Olympics, and everybody, and the police and everybody thought that this guy that was connected to the Olympics had done it, and it was a kind of disgruntled guy that lived in the basement kind of a thing. And we all went with that. Mm-hmm. And there were headlines in the paper on that. And it turns out he had nothing to do with it. And the same thing after Robert Kennedy's plane crashed off New England, and I covered that, and I showed up, and nobody knew what had really happened. And a lot of what I realized I now said on the air was incorrect. And the same thing after the night of the Bush-Gore election in 2000, when first Bush had won, and then Gore had won, and then Bush had won, and then Gore had won, and we announced the new president several times, and several times got it wrong. And so you have to go into those things knowing that that initial information is probably going to be incorrect, and the less you say sometimes is sometimes the best approach.
That's great advice for being a viewer. It makes me really take that into consideration when something is a breaking news story.
Yeah, understand that there's a force to get information out there, but much of the information that will go out there will be incorrect. But it's not to me, sometimes you've done sloppy reporting,
right.
And sometimes you should have been smarter than that. But a lot of times you're working with the best stuff you got, right? If you want the reality, come back in a day, and you'll get a much clearer sense. But who does that?
Right. It's not fake news. It's just incorrect information.
Right.
So there's a difference to that. So if you were going to give advice to a young YouTuber out there, what tips or advice would you give them?
Well, I have 3 million hits on YouTube.
Really?
Yes. For a blooper. Ellen DeGeneres runs it every year on her show.
No kidding.
Yeah, on a blooper reel.
Wow.
Doing something totally embarrassing, which has a whole context to it where it makes sense. But if you only see the blooper, it's hilarious. And so I've got 3 million hits, so I am qualified to tell people what to do on YouTube, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because I look like a total fool in that hit.
Can we search that blooper?
Yes, you can.
What do we search for?
You've got to do that.
Oh, darn.
I'm not going to lead you to my own humiliation.
Well, you know I'm going to look it up.
Okay, there you go. I came along in the industry before YouTube, and so there are ways that people tell stories through video that I don't know how to do. And I used to think I knew how to do that stuff, but I now realize in my current position as we try to reach especially teenagers and students, prospective students, that I don't know how to do that anymore. And so I use other people and work with other people who are better at using video to reach an audience in a way that it's sailed, and I didn't get on the ship. But that said, there are a couple of things I think that no matter what kind of video story you're doing, you can think about. I knew when I did local television and network television that as you put a piece together, it always makes sense to you because you're so in the middle of it, right? You know every piece of it. The jokes make sense, the video sequence makes sense, the story makes sense. And so what I always would do when there was time was bring somebody in who didn't know the story and have them look at it and then tell me what they saw. And often what you think is blazingly obvious isn't at all. And the jokes aren't funny, or the sequence doesn't make sense, or what you think is the essential part of the story hasn't been communicated at all, because the way you see it is so different than the way people consume it. The second thing I always did is when I was at somebody's house or at home or on the road and people were watching television, I watched them watch television and watched how they consumed it. Because there's a sense when you're making a video that everyone's going to sit in a dark room in a comfortable chair and watch it on a big screen and be totally absorbed in it. And the reality is most of my stories aired while people were making macaroni and cheese or dealing with the dog or arguing with their husband or whatever. It wasn't the centerpiece of their lives the way it was at the core of my life.
Yeah.
And so that changes how you communicate. And it makes it that the messaging has to be simpler and so obvious that it cuts through all the other things that are going on when someone is looking at one of your videos. And so I would say make sure that somebody who doesn't know it sees it before you post it. And the second thing is watch how other people consume media. And I learned a lot from that.
So how has the media changed? We have the internet now,
Right.
and everything's different. People don't watch television as much.
Right.
How do you think media has changed, and has the internet made it better or worse?
Certainly better, because this is the golden age of information. If you want information, it's out there in any form you want it, and any style you want it. You can consume it in any way you want it. It's the golden corral of the media age, right?
Right.
It's just like, including the chocolate fountain somewhere if we look for it. And so in that sense, it's fabulous. It opens up all these job opportunities that weren't there before. It used to be a very tight group of people that were allowed to tell stories to Americans. When I was a kid, we had 3 channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and you had 3 local newscasts, and a very small group, right? And so what's changed is it's now this wide open thing, and there's as much information as you want to get. The flip side of that is there's so much information that it's now incumbent on us to be good consumers, to know what we're looking for, to pick the truth from the untruth, and to create a menu for us that's healthy and makes us better citizens. And of course that's the risk now, is that if you on Facebook only have friends who are from one side or the other, you're only going to see the world from one side or the other. And so when it comes time to sort of compromise and reach agreement on things, we can't do it because we simply can't conceive that somebody has that opposite opinion. How can they be so stupid?
As an instructor of one of the classes over at Indiana University,
Right.
what have you noticed about the new Generation Z students?
Sure. Well, one of the things I've seen, I teach a class in writing for public affairs, how to write news releases and op-eds, policy memos, and that sort of thing. One of the things I've noticed is that the instructions have to be clear and written down point by point by point by point. That if you just sort of open it up and ask for inspiration and imagination, you get a blank look. That students want very detailed instructions. The second thing that's different than perhaps my generation is we were tear gassed and we fought against the Vietnam War and we held protest signs and we thought we knew how the world should work. Is students today are more passive, not necessarily less engaged, but less likely to put up a fight. I think we're seeing that change a little bit with the shooting in Florida and sort of a rise of rebellion, which I think is a fabulous thing. It's great to see. But I remember in college we fought back against professors who we thought were full of it or were going in some direction we didn't think we should go. And today there's less of that. I'd kind of like more back and forth with students, but they tend not to want to do that. On the other hand, they're much nicer human beings than we ever were. We were nasty. We could be difficult. We could be childish. We could be sort of wildly exuberant. And the students I work with now are smarter, better prepared, and better citizens largely than we ever were. They just want things spelled out very, very clearly. They want a model to work from, a template, and that if you just sort of say, go, what you get back is, huh?
So Jim, to wrap up the show, I have one final question.
Sure.
If you had to write a story that motivated young adults, what would be your angle and what would be the headline?
Well, I think there's a tendency, certainly I was when I was 18 or 19 or 20, to think grown-ups suck, and that society as a whole isn't very positive. What I learned as a reporter is that there are amazing, wonderful, remarkable, life-changing people all around you. You just don't know it as you go through life. And one of the things as a reporter you get to do is meet some of those people, but you don't have to be a reporter to meet them. They're around you if you look for them. Do you have time for a story?
Of course.
Okay. I was a reporter in Colorado working for a TV station in Denver, and a professor at Colorado State University was kidnapped by the Hezbollah in Lebanon. He had gone to Lebanon, left his family in Colorado to help the Lebanese people eat better and grow better crops and have healthier cattle. And he knew when he went to Beirut that he was going into the middle of a difficult situation. He was kidnapped by the Hezbollah. I didn't know this guy. His name's Tom Sutherland. And I didn't know his family. And he became at the centerpiece of this international controversy as he and several other Americans were held hostage. And not for a few weeks or a few months, but for year after year after year. Over the course of that time, I got to know his family very well. I got to know his daughters and his wife, and there were moments when it seemed like Tom was going to get released, and we would do constant stories. They went to the UN to appeal for his release. They went to President Reagan to appeal for his release. There were ceremonies every year on his birthday, on the anniversary of his kidnapping, and he had no contact with the outside world. As it turns out, we found out later that he was often, for year after year after year, held prisoner in a dark room. You would think that his family would be incredibly bitter, that they would be angry at our country for not doing enough to free him, and that they would certainly be angry at his captors, right? Because they'd taken their dad, they'd taken their husband away in the prime of his life, and all he had done is go there to help people. He was not a bad dude. He was a good guy, and he was gone. And so we did all of these stories. In the course of this, I met his family, and they turned out to be the most incredible people I'd ever met. Instead of being angry, they understood why he'd been taken. They understood that he was a political pawn. They understood the forces that were involved. They prayed. They were Methodists in the local church in Fort Collins. They prayed for not only for him, but for his captors, that they would come to some sort of understanding so that he could be free. And so year after year went by, and we didn't know when Tom would get out. And I'd done probably 100 stories about a man I'd never met. I'd never heard his voice. I just had a still picture of him. This was before there was video of everybody, right?
Yeah.
And so finally word came that there had been an arrangement made and that the Americans were going to be freed. And so we went to the Sutherland's house in the morning and we did some live shots for the Today Show, and there was champagne, and then everybody had to get on a plane in Denver and fly to Wiesbaden, Germany, which is an American military base where they take people who are held captive and sort of have them go through a process, because it's quite dramatic to go from something like that to being back with your family, and they have to check them out and all that. So Tom had to be taken from Lebanon through Syria and then flown. Once he got into free space in Syria, he would be flown to Germany. At the same time, we were flying from Denver to Germany. This is shortly after airplanes were fitted with phones so that you could have, like, in the back of the seat.
Right.
Remember those?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're flying to Germany. And NBC was carrying Sutherland. As soon as he got into Syria, they had a news conference for him. And they were carrying it live. And because I was an NBC reporter, I could call into the control room and hear the feed of Tom talking as a free man. And I took the phone and I gave it, I'm going to start crying here.
Oh.
I gave it to his wife and and for the first time in 6 years, they heard his voice.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you're thinking, this is incredible, right? That I'm in the middle of this with people I care so much about. So then we go to Germany, and they go off and meet Tom, and the reporters all stand there, and hours pass, and it's raining, and they're going to bring the family out for a photo op. And so we're all standing there at the hospital, and they're going to bring them out on a patio. And first come the wife and the daughters, who I knew well, and they said a couple words. And then Tom comes out, and I'd never seen the man before. And they had just seen him for a couple of hours. And he comes out, and one of the reporters yelled up, "Tom, got anything to say?" And Gene Sullivan, his wife, said, "No words, only hugs." And they all did one of those things. And I stood there like I am right now.
Yeah.
Like totally, I had lost it. You know, what story can you tell other than that picture and that moment? And what that was, is what made it so special, is because those people were so special. And if that story hadn't happened, they were my neighbors. I never would have met them. I never would have known how incredible they were until that happened. And the thing is those people are all around us. We just don't know who they are. And the key is somehow in your life is figuring out who those people are.
Wow, what a way to wrap up this video. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was fun.
It was so interesting to talk to you. Wow. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you can join us next week on 80/20 TV. Thanks again to Jim Hanchett for joining us today for some very compelling stories.